What's going on, guys? This is Rob. If you guys enjoy my content, make sure you hit the subscribe button and make sure you hit that little bell so you never miss out on my sexy voice. Okay, so continuing on with our X-Men Messiah Complex videos, this is the birth of the first mutant since the House of M, since everybody lost their powers. So again, it's a pretty cool, it's a pretty big deal, and it's really, really exciting. But in the last video, it was really just like the one shot, the one that kind of set the stage for all this stuff, in the sense that you basically just had like this mutant being born. Basically, the X-Men were made aware of it by Cerebro and Charles Xavier. They were sent to Alaska to find this kid, only to find out that everybody was aware of it, and it seemed like the X-Men were the last people to the party. And so once we start to get back to them basically returning to the Xavier Institute, then the question becomes, who could possibly have taken it? And the initial response of the X-Men is Mr. Sinister. It makes the most sense. One thing to bear in mind here, for those of you guys who are new to the X-Men mythos, is that historically, Mr. Sinister has always been a villain who was obsessed with genes. Specifically, he was obsessed with the genes of Cyclops and Jean Grey. But the idea was that he's always trying to find a way to create like the most powerful mutant ever, or like the perfect mutant. Now, a lot of that really stems from the fact that he was transformed from Nathaniel Essex into Mr. Sinister by the villain Apocalypse, and so it was really more of like a personal vendetta to try to achieve that goal than anything else. But being able to control a person of that kind of power would grant him virtually, virtual world domination. He could literally control the world because there'd be nobody there that would be able to stop him because this creation would be so powerful. And so this obviously strikes the interests of Mr. Sinister, and that's why all the X-Men are really kind of panicking, because if Mr. Sinister has this child, then one, it'll become corrupted undoubtedly by the teachings of Mr. Sinister, and two, they'll probably never find it because Sinister is exceedingly good at keeping himself hidden away from the world through various bunkers and different things like that. Now, the other half of this is, remember, there's a lot of things coming out of the X-Men mythos that we've covered so far that have led to this rift between Cyclops and Professor X. And that's one of the reasons why it's cool, is because Cyclops has always been like the soldier of Professor X. He always did whatever Professor X wanted him to do. But then suddenly Cyclops started learning all these things. Like there was a hidden X-Men team that consisted of the third Summers brother that Cyclops never knew about and was never told about. That Cyclops' mind was wiped of all those different memories. And so because of this, Cyclops doesn't trust Xavier anymore, because when he looks at him, all he sees is like lies and hidden truths. After the events of House of M, when Charles Xavier had basically vanished, Emma Frost and Cyclops had taken over leadership of the X-Men. But because of all this distrust that's going on, when Charles Xavier came back, Cyclops and Emma Frost did not hand control back over to Xavier. So at this point, he's just a figurehead. And so what we end up finding out here again is that because the Acolytes work closely with Sinister's Marauders, the only real lead the X-Men have is to track down the Acolytes and in turn hope the Acolytes will lead them to the Marauders of Mr. Sinister. But it's cool because the Acolytes are not really an old school X-Men team, but basically the Acolytes are a group of people who always did believe that Magneto was right. And at this point, they're just kind of waiting for Magneto. I mean, really just kind of hoping that he comes back or something along those lines. At the moment Magneto's depowered, at the time this story is being written, he actually ends up getting his powers back. But it is cool because the Acolytes have faced off against the X-Men time and time again. And so with the X-Men tracking these guys down, the biggest thing they have to realize, and the one thing they really take advantage of, is the element of surprise and moving quick and fast. Because if they give the Acolytes time to like marshal their forces, they'll probably have a pretty lengthy fight with the X-Men. They won't necessarily win per se, but they'll still have a pretty interesting fight between the two of them. Picking up with the Xavier Institute is kind of interesting here because the X-Men team is met by the arrival of Jimmy Madrox, Multiple Man, and Richter. Now, Richter is an old school character. He debuted back in like 1987 with X Factor, issue number 17, I think it was. And he was a Louise Simonson and Walter Simonson creation, at least assuming that my memory of when he shows up is correct. But he was basically part of that era where Marvel had broken the original X-Men off of like the X-Men team. And so you basically had X Factor with Cyclops, Jean, Angel, Beast, and Iceman. And Richter was actually a kid whose father was killed by Strife, the clone of Cable from the future. And of course, his powers to manipulate, seismic activity, those manifested, and ultimately he was discovered, rescued by X Factor, and basically became like one of the early trainees for the team. The issue here is that after the events of House of M, he's one of a multitude of mutants who had basically been depowered. Now, the Multiple Man, with Jamie Madrox, he's kind of intriguing because he leads the newest generation of X Factor. And that's one of the things I wanted to mention for a second is you had the original X Factor, which was basically the original Stan Lee, Jack Kirby team that was updated and given a more modern line of stories by Louise and Walter Simonson. After that, you had X Factor Volume 2, or really like the second iteration of the team, which was basically a government-sanctioned superhero team, which was led by like Valerie Cooper, and it was led by Forge. And then you have like the newest, or at least the newest iteration of X Factor at the time this story was written, which was basically a detective team. They were like Alias Investigations with Jessica Jones, except it was X Factor. Now, the other half of this is Lela Miller. Now, Lela Miller is a girl that Marvel never figured out what to do with. She was a character that was created by Brian Michael Michael Bendis, I'm pretty sure. And it was basically just this idea that like she knows things, like she understands things are happening. And like what that means is just ambiguous. It's a way, it was really a way for like various Marvel writers to throw her into a story and say, and this is how we get out of the hole that we've written. She's the definitive plot device for any writer. But the idea is that at this point in time, she's still very much ambiguous. She's still really kind of sparked the curiosity of a lot of people. And so all she really says is like things are changing and like things are different now, and basically just saying like obvious things that really serve no real purpose. But still, what we end up doing is having Cyclops split the group into two factions. The first is to have Richter travel to the Purifiers and basically become an undercover operative and see what's going on. The other half is to send Jamie Madrox and Lela Miller to visit Forge and see if he can figure out anything about what's taking place and what else happening. And so ultimately what ends up happening is we switch over to Chelsea, New York. And this is cool because we initially pick up with Wolfsbane. Now Wolfsbane, of course, is one of the original New Mutants. She'd been around for quite some time. She was a Chris Claremont creation, and she was part of the original New Mutants team. She was originally, and God, her name is, I want to say it's Sinclair, but I can never remember her first name. But basically, she was one of the mutants that was discovered by Moira McTaggart. Wolfsbane has kind of been like this off and on character where she just kind of appears and then leaves and then appears and then leaves, and she really just kind of shows up on whatever the story calls for. But in this instance, she's actually here invading this Purifier's home base of operations. But the reason why is because, of course, with her having like a physical transformation that will obviously invoke the curiosity of anybody, the Purifiers immediately track her down. When they do, it allows for Richter to step in and start firing shots at Wolfsbane, not actually hitting her, but basically give off the appearance that he's someone who's anti-mutant and work his way into the Purifiers proper. From there, like we pick up with Jamie Madrox and Lela Miller showing up at the residence of Forge. Now, we've talked about this before. I just want to kind of rehash this again for those people who are new here. You have Forge and then you have Tony Stark. Forge is like really good at building stuff. He's super good at like figuring out how things work because that's his power. His power is to know how machines work, to be able to like reverse engineer them, to pick them apart, all that kind of good stuff. If he lost his powers, he would be no more capable of figuring out the Tony Stark Iron Man armor than like you or me. And that's the difference between Tony Stark and Forge. Now, having said that, the reason why Jamie Madrox is here alongside Lela Miller is because what Forge has discovered is that after the events of House of M, there were no more mutants, right? I mean, that's one of the things that we talked about is like the actions of the Scarlet Witch and like depowering the mutant population on Earth, that had a multiversal effect. It spread all throughout the multiverse. But ever since this child's been born, there are two timelines that have basically sparked up where now there is essentially like mutants rising to prominence in those two different realities. And so what Forge has done is he's basically created a machine that will essentially allow like Jamie Madrox to send duplicates through space and time into these different realities. And what he can do is gather information on what these realities are, how these mutants came into existence, whether or not it all stems back to like the main Marvel universe, and these are branch off universes, whatever the case may be, he can gather all that information using his investigation skills and then report back. Now, the actual duplicates themselves, and here's kind of the screwed up thing about it, the duplicates themselves won't actually come back, but we don't initially know this. Instead, all we know is Jamie Madrox grabs his duplicates and sends them into the time stream, but Lela Miller runs up and grabs one of them and gets thrown into the alternate universe alongside the duplicate of Jamie Madrox. And when the main Jamie is like, well, we have to do something, we have to get her back, that's when Forge reveals it's a one-way trip. It was never designed to be a two-way trip. They're duplicates. Jamie Madrox can make, almost any number of himself. The purpose of the duplicates was to go into those universes, gather that information, and then basically there was a subroutine or kind of a subconscious thought that was planted in their minds of they have to kill themselves, and when they do, all that information will return back to the main Jamie, and he can basically report on what he found. But with Lela Miller being thrown into that alternate reality, essentially, there's no way for her to get back now. Ultimately, Jamie Madrox just kind of collapses when all that happens. Now, at this point, we switch over to Wolverine himself, and this is one of the things that I love about Wolverine's character, right? Like Wolverine makes his way, of course, he's suffering like these extreme injuries, basically gets yanked into a hospital. We end up finding out that he just like walked right in front of an ambulance, and so they brought him to a local hospital. And one of the guys addresses the local nurse or doctor as Amelia, and then Wolverine pipes up and is like, would that be Amelia Voght? Because if it is, that's the person we're looking for. It immediately pops up when she realizes that it's Wolverine. Now, for those of you guys who don't know, Amelia Voght is a character who debuted back in the early 90s X-Men explosion, which is to say Marvel looking at like the X-Men line of stories that had just risen in popularity just increasingly. I mean, they had risen in popularity almost exponentially ever since Chris Claremont took over the stories in 1975. And so in the early 1990s, the X-Men were hugely popular, but Amelia was basically a character who was introduced who had nursed Charles Xavier back to health after he lost the use of his legs. And the result was that they had kind of come together and they had a romantic relationship of sorts. Of course, that's all explained back in like Uncanny X-Men number 300, I think. But the whole idea was that she's a character who was there that Xavier was in love with is somewhere along the line. Now, in terms of her powers and her history, she eventually joined the Acolytes for a time, but she has the ability to turn herself and anything else into vapor and basically like fly about and do whatever it is she wants to do. But what this does is it allows for the rest of the X-Men to respawn. As Amelia Voght, acting as Vapor, she's the perfect person for Storm to just like seize control of. And that's exactly what Storm does. Storm basically uses her powers of the wind to kind of contain Amelia, to keep her under control. And that's when we end up finding out that what the X-Men are hunting for, what they're looking for, is not just the Marauders and not just Mr. Sinister. They're looking for the person who can lead them to Mr. Sinister and the Marauders. This person, of course, basically being Exodus. Now, Exodus, he is insane. He's like a ridiculously powerful telepath and telekinetic. He's wildly powerful, which means if Exodus is involved in this, then if the X-Men don't play things carefully, they will all die. Like, Exodus is really, really amazing. He's one of my favorite characters out there in Marvel Comics. At least he was back then. But switching back over to Richter, who's basically meeting with these purifiers, this is when we start to find out that their work under William Stryker never actually ended. That where William Stryker is dead, that he's basically gone now, they continued on. And not only do they have a residence here in this location, they also have residences everywhere, even in New York and even in Washington, D.C. itself. And all these different warehouses are stockpiled with all manner of weapons, super high caliber weapons, super technologically advanced weapons, like weapons of mass destruction, the whole 9 yards. They're basically building a campaign for war. They're going to wage war against the entirety of mutant kind. And they're doing this because someone somewhere has told them that the birth of this new mutant will lead to the ruin of all, that it'll lead to the destruction of all of humanity across the world. So the question is, who in the world is going to stop it? But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoy this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.